8:05 here at 55 KRCD Talk Station. A very happy Wednesday to you. Bottom of the hour, every Wednesday at 8:30. Judge Anna Napolitano. Today we'll be talking with the judge about the CIA wanting more power to spy on Americans. But in the meantime, I am pleased to welcome to the 55 KRC Morning Show, Scott Walter. He's the president of Capital Research Center, author of the new book we're going to be talking about, Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. His background, he served as George W. Bush administration special assistant to the president for domestic policy and was vice president at the Philanthropy Roundtable, editing Philanthropy magazine, producing donor guidebooks, and on assistance to the poor, public policy research, and other topics. He's testified to 5 different congressional committees about this Arabella organization we're going to be talking about. Frequent media guest. He's been on radio and television across this country. He's written for some of the greatest newspapers around, including my favorite, the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to the 55 KRC Morning Show, Scott Walter. It is indeed a pleasure to have you on.
Great to be with you, Brian.
Well, let's see. The logical question is, what is Arabella, which is probably the most powerful, nefarious organization that my listeners have never heard of?
Yep, exactly. Arabella itself, Arabella Advisors, is a for-profit consulting firm in D.C., Beltway Bandit, we call them, and it created and operates half a dozen nonprofits of multiple types, and they channel billions of dollars from Soros, Gates, Zuckerberg, on and on, into political fighting.
Pot stirring, as I like to call it, dividing the country on literally every given topic that you can come up with, from gender to, green energy policies.
That's exactly right. You know, if you see the Department of Education is start trying to demand that boys play in girls' sports, that's Arabella. If you see your a ballot, you're in Ohio, you've had all those ballot initiatives. Guess who's one of the very top funders of your ballot initiative fights in Ohio? Somebody sitting in a D.C. office.
Well, it doesn't beg the question. It demands asking the question. What the hell is their motive? What is their underlying goal? There has to be an end game. Like China's got a 100-year plan. They know direction they're going to go, and they plan accordingly. What is with Arabella? What do they seek to do?
Well, of course, I can't, spy directly into their mind, but I can see a pattern, which is, guess what? Ever less control for people in Ohio over how Ohio people live, and ever more control from the fabulously wealthy and politically connected over your lives.
Well, that seems such a twisted sort of DSM-5 diagnosis, like they should all be labeled as, sociopaths. Why do they want to control us? They're all billionaires. They all have more money they could ever hope to spend in the world. Why do they use all these massive sums of money to want to control our lives?
Unfortunately, of course, people do get twisted. They especially, if you have that much money, you can think that, you're better than everybody else and you should be running everything. Plus, of course, if you're controlling everything, it's often very easy to get even more money.
Yeah. So this is ultimately self-fulfilling. Now, you're talking about money. Put it in straightforward terms about the amount of money this organization has and puts to these nefarious works. I mean, this is genuine, real money.
Sure. For the 2020 election cycle, right, so that's 2 years, 19 and 20, their nonprofit side raked in $2.4 billion. That's more than the DNC and the RNC combined, plus $1 billion more. In 2022, even though it's an off year, they did even better, $3 billion, which is more than the DNC, the RNC, and the Republican and Democrats Senate fundraising committee and House fundraising committee.
And they're using this money to form, organizations to infiltrate on any given topics? Are they paying people to be, quote-unquote, volunteers? When you see groups of protesters in the streets, sometimes we hear that they're being paid by organizations. Is this one of the sources of funding?
Well, the short answer to all questions about Arabella is everything, right? Which is to say they play on virtually every issue and they operate in virtually every way. So if you see a Facebook ad about a Senate race, well, that might well be paid for by Arabella. Or if you see some group you've never heard of before, they have hilarious names, like Floridians for a Fair Shake and Secure Michigan Elections. And I apologize, I should have looked up some of the Ohio ones. I don't remember them off the top of my head. But those, fake groups are also quite possibly Arabella, because they literally have created hundreds of such groups.
Well, specifically, can you give my listeners an example of how Arabella's work and this money has actually had an impact on America? And I, particularly a strong defender of the freedoms that our Constitution guarantees, how have they effectively undermined our freedoms and liberties with this work?
Well, one of the ways I mentioned the Department of Education regulations, right? Which are messing with things like girls' sports and many other things. So 2 years before the Biden administration even took office, you had some Soros money going to a secretive Arabella group that worked with Harvard Law folks to craft very sophisticated legal memos about exactly how they could reverse all of the Trump regulatory reforms that he made, right? So they're planning this years in advance, super secret. Then they're working with the gatekeepers in the new administration who control the regulatory apparatus, right, for things like Title IX Department of Education rules. So that would be one example. Another example is on the abortion issue. Almost, the biggest funders of abortion by far are an Arabella group that gets millions and millions from Warren Buffett. He's yet another of the left's billionaires.
Well, how did you learn about Arabella? This is the first time most of my listeners, I think, have heard of it. I'd never heard of it before. And honestly, sir, I spend hours and hours every single day, scouring the media for topics related to my morning show. I've heard Soros over and over. I've heard Zuckerbucks over and over. I've heard Warren Buffett over and over. Where did Arabella come from, and how did you learn about it?
Well, by the way, on Zuckbucks, which there's great stuff at our website, capitalresearch.org, on Zuckbucks, Arabella played in that little pond. In addition to Zuck's $420 million in 2020, Arabella threw in $25 million. So even they're players. Now, the way we found them is back in, you remember the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination vicious battle, right?
Who could forget?
Well, there was a brand new group that was leading the left-wing charge on that called Demand Justice. And we noticed that as soon as the fight was starting, and nobody'd heard of it before. It was brand new. Turns out, yes, once again, Mr. Soros, he gave it the seed money that launched it shortly before the Kavanaugh nomination fight broke out. It's still around, still getting Arabella money. And when we looked at that, we discovered, wait a minute, Demand Justice doesn't really exist. It's not some independent nonprofit out there like my think tank is. It is just a project of something called the 1630 Fund, which is a political nonprofit. And then what we discovered then is, well, wait a minute, 1630 Fund isn't the end of the story. 1630 Fund is one of a half dozen nonprofits created and operated by Arabella advisors that at that point were taking in $750 million in a year, and yet had never been mentioned in any mainstream media. So that's why you haven't heard of them.
A guest today, Scott Walter, author of this book, Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. Now, the interests of America are obviously being undermined, our freedoms and liberties, in the name of whatever power and control they want to wield over us. This has the effect of benefiting foreign actors who are not on the side of the United States. For example, I think of China or Russia or Iran or North Korea. Is there any foreign money flowing into this dark money organization?
That's a terrific question, because yet another billionaire, probably you and your listeners have not heard of, Hans Wiese, he has put $250 million into Arabella for 2 decades now. He is a foreign national, so it's completely illegal for him to be trying to influence our politics. And by the way, not everybody across the spectrum doesn't want that, right? Even left-wingers don't want foreign billionaires messing with our politics. He's given hundreds of millions to Arabella, and he's done it almost from day one. He was, as far as we can tell, their original sugar daddy back in like 07, 08, when they were barely bringing in $1 million a year. And he is a nasty piece of work. We know he's flatly violated campaign finance laws by writing checks to things like Friends of Dick Durbin. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations expired before anybody caught that. But you can still see the donations in the FEC database.
Well, not so shocking that Dick got money from these folks. But what of those out there in the audience who might be going, yeah. Well, okay, Arabella's left-wing dark money, but what about right-wing dark money, like the Koch brothers or whatever? Is there a parallel that can be drawn with any other organization, comparable or otherwise, to this Arabella group?
Well, the first thing to remember is the left is the party of the rich, right? So there is nothing that is remotely on the scale of Arabella, including the Kochs. And then second of all, of course, while Arabella is joined at the hip with the Democratic Party, the Kochs, of course, have not been for years. They've not been particularly in sync with the Republican Party or Donald Trump. You know, whether you like that or you don't, that's the fact.
Well, have they been involved in any of these divisive election issues? Like, for example, one of my listener friends who was aware of Arabella and apparently alerted me to this some time ago, that they were funding Nikki Haley's run against Donald Trump. And any truth to that kind of thing? The manipulation that goes on the conservatives or the Republican side of the ledger?
Oh, it's certainly true that the Kochs put lots of money behind Nikki Haley. Yes.
I was speaking more of Arabella.
Off the top of my head, I'm not aware of. Of course, some of this wouldn't be disclosed yet.
Was anybody at the Department of Justice? I know that sounds like a foolish question, considering the current Department of Justice, and we know how biased they are. But is anybody looking into this in terms of foreign money influencing our elections? Because again, that is a violation of the law.
Well, you answered your own question about the Biden administration, and I always, when I testify, I always say, look, I'm not calling for, because the IRS is sort of the first agency for these groups because they're nonprofits, and the IRS is supposed to oversee nonprofits. I always say, look, the solution to the Arabella problem is never going to be more IRS enforcement because Lois Lerner is always going to be in charge. You can just forget it. There's never going to be a fair-minded IRS. But I will say that as you mentioned, I've testified to 5 different committees on this, and at least some of them, like the House Ways and Means Committee, which oversees tax law, including exempt organizations, and the House Administration Committee, both of them have had hearings talking about dark money and the like.
Well, I have to end on this legitimate and logical conversation. Scott Walter, author of the book Arabella. Is there anything we can do about it? Can this problem be solved? Again, I was looking for perhaps some sort of, prosecution for foreign money, but what can we out here in the unwashed masses do to counter this massive $3 billion annual collection and influence of our elections and our lives?
Well, it's a Wizard of Oz operation, right? The wizard looked really scary until the little dog pulled the curtain back and you saw it was just some little guy in front of a microphone, right? So the more you know about this kind of thing, the less powerful they are. If you can explain, hey, Michiganders for a secure elections aren't Michiganders. They're somebody sitting on K Street in D.C. So, that ruins the power a lot.
It really does, and you have Scott Walter to thank for exposing all this in the book that all my listeners are going to want to buy. They can get a copy of it at 55krc.com. There's a link to where they can get it. Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America, by my guest today, Scott Walter. Scott, thank you for what you've done in the name of freedoms and liberties. I'll strongly recommend my listeners get this book and learn about it and share the info with their friends.